The medieval brewery was not the romantic, cozy workshop of craft beer enthusiasts that we might picture today. It was often a dim, smoky space where every surface seemed to carry the residue of years of neglect. Imagine barrels stacked in shadowed corners, their wood swollen and darkened by years of absorbing liquid, spattered with stains whose origins no one dared question. The air was thick with the sour, almost metallic tang of fermenting grain, a smell that clung to the walls. The brewers' clothes, even the mugs in which the drink would be served. There were no gleaming steel vats, no temperature gauges, no sanitation protocols, just open containers, makeshift tools, and a reliance on tradition that often meant repeating the same mistakes for generations. Hygiene, as we understand it, was not part of the equation. Brewers rarely washed their equipment thoroughly, partly because water itself was often scarce or contaminated, and partly because the concept of invisible microbes simply didn't exist. Scrubbing out a brewing vat might mean a quick rinse with whatever liquid was available, sometimes even the same water that carried waste downstream from the village. Wooden paddles used to stir the mash could be caked with old, dried residue from previous batches, harboring all manner of bacteria and fungi. These microorganisms thrived in the damp, warm environment, transforming what could have been a nourishing drink into a slow-acting poison. Before we dive into this journey through the shadowy corners of medieval life, take a moment to join our growing community. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story, and while you're here, drop a comment telling me what time it is right now where you are in the world. I want to picture exactly when and where you're hearing these words, whether it's morning coffee in the quiet, midnight curiosity in the dark, or anything in between. The ingredients themselves were no safer. Grain sacks might have sat in damp storage for months, attracting rodents and insects. Brewers would often sift out the worst of the infestations and proceed as if nothing had happened, convinced that the brewing process would burn away any impurities. This belief was comforting, but dangerously wrong. Without controlled boiling temperatures or proper fermentation practices, harmful pathogens could easily survive and find their way into the mugs of unsuspecting drinkers. In an age without scientific understanding, the connection between the strange fevers that swept through a village and the beer that everyone drank was almost impossible to make. Even the brewing water, a key component in beer's creation, was a hazard. Rivers and wells were frequently polluted by human and animal waste. In some towns, brewers took water from the same source where laundry was washed, animals drank, and refuse was dumped. While the heat of brewing could kill some contaminants, many batches were brewed only lightly heated or fermented at ambient temperatures, allowing dangerous microbes to linger. People drank beer not only for pleasure, but often as a safer alternative to water. Ironically, that very beer might be the source of the illnesses they sought to avoid. In many cases, brewers worked in cramped conditions where animals roamed freely. Cats were welcome for controlling rats, but they also left behind hair, fleas, and waste. Dogs might wander through the brewing area drawn by the smell of grain and leave muddy paw prints on the very floors where barrels were filled. Such scenes were not unusual. They were part of the daily reality of brewing in a world without modern cleanliness. To the people of the time, the idea that these conditions could affect their health simply never crossed their minds. The lack of hygiene also extended to the serving of beer. Cups and mugs were communal, passed from hand to hand in taverns without being properly washed. A quick swill in a bucket of cloudy water was the best a patron could hope for before the next round was poured. The wooden mugs themselves absorbed moisture and harbored bacteria in tiny cracks and splinters, adding another layer of invisible danger with each sip. Patrons might notice a strange aftertaste or an unpleasant sourness, but the social setting, the warmth of the alcohol, and the lack of alternatives meant they drank anyway. These unhygienic practices were not seen as flaws in the process. They were simply the way things had always been done. In a time when life expectancy was short and daily survival was a constant challenge, the subtle, long-term effects of contaminated beer rarely drew attention. People might chalk up recurring illnesses to bad air, curses, or seasonal change, never realizing that the tankard in their hand was part of the problem. In this environment, the very drink that promised comfort, camaraderie, and relief from the hardships of medieval life could also be a silent contributor to its brevity. And yet, the medieval world thrived on its beer. It was the drink of peasants and nobles alike, consumed with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It fueled laborers in the fields and soldiers on the march. It was at the center of social gatherings, celebrations, and religious feasts. The danger was invisible, and perhaps that was what made it so insidious. No one expected harm from something so familiar. But familiarity didn't make it safe, and the brewing process, left unchecked, was a perfect breeding ground for problems that could erupt without warning. If the brewing space itself was a hazard, the barrels in which beer was stored were often even worse. In the medieval world, a barrel was not just a container. It was a long-term fixture, patched and reused until the wood could no longer hold liquid. These barrels were made of porous oak or other woods that absorbed everything they touched, locking in moisture, yeast, and residue from countless previous batches. Over time, these damp, nutrient-rich interiors became breeding grounds for mold. Sometimes it formed as a thin white bloom along the seams, other times as thick, dark patches hidden deep in the staves where no one could see without dismantling the barrel entirely. The smell of a moldy barrel was unmistakable to modern noses, earthy, damp, and faintly sour, but to a medieval brewer, it was simply part of the beer's character. With no understanding of microbial contamination, a slightly musty aroma could be mistaken for richness or maturity. Tavern keepers often prided themselves on their aged barrels, believing the lingering flavors from previous brews would enhance the next batch. In reality, those lingering flavors often carried harmful fungi and bacteria that could alter not just the taste, but the safety of the beer. Barrels were rarely cleaned in the way we think of cleaning today. A brewer might rinse one with a splash of water, or at best, scald it with hot liquid if the fire was already burning. But without scrubbing the interior, the sticky residue clinging to the wood remained intact, layer upon layer, year after year. Any crack in the wood could trap pockets of old beer, turning rancid and festering over time. When a new brew was poured in, it mingled with these remnants, picking up both their flavor and their contaminants. Moisture seepage was another constant problem. Even the most skilled cooper could not create a perfect seal forever. Over time, wood warped and joints loosened, especially if the barrel was stored in damp cellars or outside in varying weather. Tiny leaks not only wasted beer, but also allowed air and microorganisms to enter. Insects could find their way in too, laying eggs in the damp cracks or feeding on the sweet residue inside. Sometimes brewers or tavern keepers tried to patch these leaks with wax, resin, or cloth, but these quick fixes often trapped even more moisture underneath, creating the perfect environment for mold to flourish unseen. The danger wasn't only in the storage, it was in the transportation. Beer barrels were rolled over muddy roads, hauled onto ships exposed to salty spray, and left in markets under the heat of the sun. Temperature changes accelerated spoilage, and mold thrived in the fluctuating conditions. A barrel that left a brewery smelling fine could arrive at its destination already tainted, yet the beer inside would still be served without hesitation. Patrons might notice an odd bitterness or a faint chalky aftertaste, but complaints rarely went far. In many places, alehouses simply had no alternative stock to offer. Interestingly, some brewers even encouraged the use of older barrels, believing they tamed the sharpness of young beer. In truth, what they were tasting was the result of slow chemical reactions between the beer and the residual mold or mildew in the wood. The drink might appear smoother, but it was also infused with microscopic spores that could irritate the digestive system or cause more serious illness. In an age when medicine was rudimentary at best, symptoms like stomach cramps, diarrhea, or lingering fatigue were often attributed to the weather, overwork, or bad humors, not to a tainted drink. For poorer taverns and rural households, barrels were an investment they couldn't afford to replace often. A single barrel might be in service for decades, passed down through generations, repaired countless times, its original shape warped into something barely round. Each repair introduced new seams and new crevices, perfect hiding places for contamination, and because the beer was often cloudy and unfiltered, it was easy to miss flecks of mold or sediment floating in a mug. A drinker might raise a toast, unaware that the cheer in their cup carried an invisible cost. The role of barrels in beer's flavor and safety was so deeply ingrained in medieval life that entire economies depended on them. Coopers, the craftsmen who made and maintained barrels, were respected tradesmen. Yet even the best cooper could not protect against the fundamental flaw. Wood was alive, breathing, absorbing, and slowly decaying. No amount of skill could turn it into an impervious container, and as those staves aged, their history seeped into every drop of beer they touched. Sometimes the consequences of a moldy barrel were swift, a spoiled batch that turned sour overnight, sending an acrid stench through the tavern. Other times, the effects were slow and cumulative, with drinkers falling ill over weeks, their ailments blending into the constant backdrop of medieval hardship. Few could pinpoint the cause, and fewer still would suspect the beloved barrels that kept their communities supplied with ale. In this way, the moldy barrel became a silent accomplice to illness, a quiet reminder that even something as communal and comforting as beer could harbor unseen dangers. And if the barrel itself could betray you, imagine what could happen when the ingredients that went inside it carried their own hidden threats. In the medieval world, flavoring beer was not just a matter of taste. It was often an act of improvisation, necessity, or even deception. Without refrigeration, without airtight storage, and with ingredients that could spoil quickly, brewers sometimes needed to mask unpleasant flavors in their beer. And the easiest way to do that was by adding herbs and plants. At first glance, this might sound harmless, even appealing. After all, many of our modern craft beers boast botanical notes. But in the Middle Ages, this practice was less about careful flavor pairing and more about using whatever was at hand, regardless of its safety. The mixture used in much of Europe before the dominance of hops was known as grüt. This was a blend of herbs, roots, and sometimes flowers, and its composition varied wildly from one region to another. Some ingredients were relatively benign, yarrow, heather, juniper berries. Others, however, could be toxic in the wrong doses. Wild rosemary, for instance, contains compounds that can cause dizziness, hallucinations, or even convulsions. Bog myrtle, another common addition, could irritate the stomach lining or cause headaches when overused. Brewers were not chemists. They worked by tradition and rumor, guided by what worked for their elders, even if it left their customers in strange states of mind. These herbs could do more than just mask the taste of a sour or stale beer. Some added bitterness that mimicked freshness, fooling the drinker into thinking the beer was well made. Others created a warming or numbing sensation that disguised the harshness of an unbalanced brew. In some cases, certain plants were added deliberately for their intoxicating effects, enhancing the beer's potency. It was not uncommon for a drinker to feel not just pleasantly drunk, but also lightheaded, feverish, or disoriented, a combination that could easily be mistaken for a strong brew rather than a dangerously adulterated one. Tavern owners and less scrupulous brewers sometimes saw these herbs as a way to stretch profits. If a batch had started to spoil, they might grind in a handful of strong-smelling plants to overpower the foul odor. Patrons, having no frame of reference for consistent beer quality, often accepted these flavors as normal. In an age where medical knowledge was limited, no one could warn them about the cumulative effect of consuming mildly toxic substances day after day. The resulting illnesses, nausea, cramping, blurred vision, were chalked up to bad luck or the humors being out of balance. It wasn't just the toxicity that was dangerous. Gathering herbs in medieval times carried its own risks. Without proper botanical knowledge, brewers could mistake one plant for another, especially if they looked similar when dried. A bundle of safe leaves from a local healer could accidentally include a sprig of something poisonous. Monkshood, for instance, with its deep purple flowers, could grow near yarrow in the wild, and its leaves could be deadly if even a small amount found its way into the brew. Once boiled and mixed with other strong flavors, its presence would be impossible to detect by taste alone. There were also cultural factors at play. In some areas, the Groot mixture was controlled by local authorities or church officials, who taxed its sale. This meant that not every brewer could afford the official blend, leading some to create cheaper imitations with whatever they could find. The result was a beer that could vary dramatically from one tavern to the next, not just in flavor, but in safety. Travelers might drink from a mug in one town and feel nothing but satisfaction, then drink from another in the next village and find themselves racked with stomach pains before nightfall. Stories circulated of bewitched beers that made men act strangely or fall ill after only a few sips. While these tales often took on supernatural overtones, the truth was usually more mundane and more dangerous. A brewer experimenting with stronger herbs might unintentionally create a brew that blurred the line between refreshment and poison. Even in monasteries, where brewing was considered an act of discipline and devotion, the use of powerful herbs was common. Monks prized certain plants for their medicinal properties, but without precise dosing, the difference between medicine and toxin was perilously small. What made the situation more treacherous was that many of these herbs had delayed effects. A person might drink heavily in the evening and feel fine when they left the tavern, only to wake hours later with a pounding head, aching limbs, or even fever. By then, the connection to the beer was lost. Illness could sweep through a household or a village, and no one would suspect the shared mug that had passed from hand to hand at the local inn. In this environment, beer was both a trusted daily drink and an unpredictable gamble. Its flavors told only part of the story. The rest was hidden in the leaves, roots, and flowers that steeped unseen in the brewing vat. And if those plants could so easily turn a friendly drink into a dangerous one, imagine what could happen when the very water used to make the beer was already a hazard before the brewing even began. Water was the foundation of every beer brewed in the medieval world, and yet it was also one of the greatest dangers. In an age before filtration, before chemical treatment, and before any real understanding of microbes, the water used for brewing often came from sources that were visibly and invisibly dirty. A village's main well might be only a few steps away from where waste was dumped. Rivers that carried cool, clear-looking water could also carry the runoff from slaughterhouses, tanneries, and human latrines upstream. The concept of clean was judged by appearance alone. If the water looked passably clear, it was considered fit for use. The problem was that danger in water is rarely visible to the naked eye. Medieval towns were crowded, and waste management was primitive. In many places, sewage flowed openly through streets or was emptied into rivers under the cover of night. Animals, chickens, pigs, cows, roamed freely, and their waste mixed with the mud and rainwater that eventually found its way into wells and streams. During heavy rains, filth from higher ground washed into every low-lying water source. Brewers might draw this water at dawn, believing the chill of morning kept it fresher, but temperature did nothing to kill the invisible pathogens swirling within. Even when water came from a well, safety was not guaranteed. Wells were often shallow, dug without proper lining, which allowed surface water to seep in along with everything it carried. A dead animal that had fallen in or been discarded nearby could contaminate the supply for weeks, and yet brewers would lower their buckets, haul up the water, and begin their work without a second thought. They trusted in the brewing process itself to purify what they could not see. It is true that boiling water during brewing could kill many harmful organisms, but medieval brewing practices didn't always involve thorough boiling. Some styles of beer were brewed with only mild heating, especially in smaller villages where fuel was scarce or expensive. In these cases, the water was never heated enough to eliminate the bacteria, parasites, or viruses it carried. Even when water was brought to a boil, the rest of the process, from cooling to fermentation, exposed it to fresh contamination from unwashed tools, dirty barrels, and the brewer's own hands. Seasonal changes also played a role in water quality. In summer, stagnant ponds and slow-moving rivers bloomed with algae and became breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects. In winter, snowmelt could flood waste pits and carry their contents into waterways. Spring brought both heavy rains and agricultural runoff, as fields treated with manure drained into the same rivers where water was drawn. No matter the time of year, there was always something in the water that could turn a batch of beer into a health hazard. For the average drinker, the idea that water could make them sick was counterintuitive. After all, beer was often considered a safer alternative to drinking water directly. And in some cases, this was true, especially for well-made beers from larger breweries that had better access to resources. But in countless small-scale operations, where every shortcut saved time and money, contaminated water passed unnoticed into the brewing vats. The taste might not reveal the danger, especially if strong herbs or heavy fermentation masked the telltale signs of foul water. Historical records tell of outbreaks where entire communities fell ill, the symptoms striking with uncanny similarity. Fever, stomach cramps, diarrhea, weakness. Physicians of the time blamed bad air, divine punishment, or even witchcraft. Few suspected the beer they drank every day, partly because it was such a staple of life. It was the drink of workers at midday, the companion of bread at supper, the refreshment served to children in watered-down form. To imagine that this trusted beverage could carry the very illness they feared was unthinkable. The irony was sharp. Beer, meant to be the safe alternative to water, could become just as dangerous when the water it was made from was already poisoned. And since brewing required large quantities of water, contamination wasn't limited to a single pint. It could affect every mug in a tavern, every barrel in storage, every festival keg tapped in celebration. The same water that gave beer its body and life could also carry the seeds of disease to an entire village. But the risks didn't stop at the moment the beer was brewed. Even when a batch was made from relatively clean water, time and poor storage could turn it sour and unsafe. And when that happened, there were no warning labels, no health inspectors, only the brewer's decision about whether to serve it anyway. A sour beer in the medieval world was not necessarily a sign that something had gone wrong, at least not in the eyes of the brewer. In fact, many medieval people were so accustomed to inconsistent brewing results that a certain tang or sharpness was accepted as normal. But there was a difference between a beer that had developed a slight tartness from natural fermentation and one that had spoiled to the point of becoming dangerous. The problem was that the line between the two was thin, and brewers, driven by necessity or profit, often chose to ignore it. Spoilage could set in quickly, especially in warmer months. Without refrigeration, beer was at the mercy of ambient temperatures. And in a damp wooden barrel, microbial activity never truly stopped. Wild yeasts and bacteria could invade the brew, feeding on the sugars left behind from fermentation and producing acids that altered both flavor and smell. A sour beer might have a cloudy appearance, a sharp vinegar-like aroma, and a prickling sensation on the tongue. But these signs were not enough to keep it from being served. In many cases, tavern keepers poured it as if it were fresh, hoping the customer would not notice or would simply accept it as part of the day's batch. There were even cultural habits that made this deception easier. Beer was often drunk from heavy, opaque mugs or shared communal cups that obscured the appearance of the liquid. In dimly lit taverns or at outdoor markets, customers rarely had the chance to inspect what they were drinking. A skilled tavern keeper might pour quickly, top off with a generous froth, and pass the mug along before anyone could sniff too closely. By the time the first sip was taken, the social pressure of the drinking environment made it awkward to complain. For the poorer classes, refusing a drink was not just unusual, it could be unthinkable. Beer was part of the daily calorie intake, a source of both hydration and sustenance, especially for those whose diets were dominated by bread and porridge. A spoiled batch meant a choice between going thirsty, risking illness, or spending money on a more expensive drink elsewhere. Most chose to drink and hope for the best. And when illness followed, it was easy to blame other factors: bad weather, overwork, or simply fate. Some brewers even developed methods to mask the signs of spoilage. Stronger herbs, extra spices, or more intense roasting of the malt could cover sourness to some degree. In extreme cases, tavern keepers mixed older beer with a small portion of fresher brew to dilute the sharpness and stretch their stock. This practice, known in later centuries as blending, could make a spoiled beer more palatable without removing its risks. In the absence of understanding about germs or toxins, the idea of diluting danger simply didn't exist. The consequences of drinking truly spoiled beer could range from mild discomfort to serious illness. For some, it meant an upset stomach, cramps, or a restless night. For others, particularly the young, the elderly, or the already sick, it could trigger dehydration, fever, and long-lasting weakness. In a society without modern medical care, what might be a temporary inconvenience today could spiral into a life-threatening condition. Historical accounts hint at clusters of unexplained sickness in towns after large public feasts, where multiple barrels from questionable stock were consumed in a single night. Interestingly, there were also those who claimed to prefer a more sour taste, particularly in certain regions where strong, tart ales became associated with tradition or local pride. But even here, the difference between intentional sourness and accidental spoilage was subtle, and many drinkers would not have been able to tell which they were getting. The danger was compounded by the fact that beer was not always drunk in moderation. Festival days, market gatherings, and military musters could see people consuming large amounts in a short period of time, magnifying any harmful effects. What made the problem so persistent was the lack of accountability. There were few regulations governing beer quality, and in rural areas, none at all. If a brewer's batch made a few customers sick, there was little recourse. Complaints might be ignored, or worse, the complainer might be accused of spreading false rumors. In an economy where reputation was fragile, people often chose silence over conflict. And so, sour beer continued to flow from taverns to tables, its dangers disguised beneath the foam. The habit of accepting spoiled beer as normal speaks to a deeper reality of medieval life. Survival often meant tolerating risks that we would find unacceptable today. People lived surrounded by hazards, contaminated food, unsanitary streets, untreated injuries, and beer was just one more gamble in a world full of them. Yet, even as drinkers lifted their mugs to their lips, they could never be entirely certain what was waiting for them inside. And when the illness came, it wasn't always clear whether it was the beer itself or something more insidious, hidden in the drinking culture of the time. One of the most unsettling aspects of drinking beer in the medieval period was that people often fell ill without ever realizing the beer was to blame. In a time when medical knowledge was primitive and the concept of invisible germs was unimaginable, the connection between a mug of ale and a night of fever, cramps, or worse was almost never made. Illness was woven so deeply into daily life that people accepted it as part of existence, not as the result of something they had consumed just hours before. The symptoms of beer-related sickness could be deceptively familiar. Stomach pain, diarrhea, dizziness, and fatigue were common in a world where contaminated food and water were part of the diet. When several members of a household or village fell ill around the same time, they might blame the changing weather, the phases of the moon, or even the wrath of God. Beer, the drink they trusted and consumed daily, was rarely considered the culprit, and so the same contaminated batches continued to be poured and shared, prolonging the cycle of sickness. This ignorance was not just a matter of lacking science, it was reinforced by cultural habits. Beer was often consumed in groups, from shared mugs and communal jugs. In taverns, a single vessel might pass through dozens of hands in a single evening, its rim touching lips that carried who knows what kind of bacteria or disease. If someone became sick after a night of drinking, they might blame the bad air of the tavern or the overindulgence in alcohol, never realizing that the real danger had been the invisible hitchhikers traveling from mouth to mouth. There were also slow-acting dangers hidden in the brewing process itself. Mold from barrels, toxins from certain herbs, bacteria from unclean water. These could cause illnesses that didn't appear until hours or even days after drinking. The delay made it nearly impossible for people to link their sickness to the beer, and because the symptoms were often the same as those caused by other medieval hazards, spoiled meat, rotting grain, foul-smelling wells, the beer remained blameless in the eyes of most drinkers. The poor suffered the most from this ignorance. Wealthier households could afford fresher beer from reputable brewers, or they had enough resources to discard a suspicious batch. But for peasants, beer was a staple too valuable to waste. Even if it tasted strange, they drank it, reasoning that a little sourness or cloudiness was nothing unusual. To refuse beer was to go without one of the few reliable sources of calories in their diet. In this way, necessity blinded them to danger. There were moments, however, when the connection between beer and sickness became undeniable. Chronicles and town records occasionally mention mysterious outbreaks following large gatherings, weddings, fairs, or harvest festivals, where beer was served in abundance. Entire groups fell ill at the same time, sometimes with fatal results. Yet even then, explanations leaned towards superstition or divine punishment rather than bad brewing. In a deeply religious society, it was easier to believe that God had struck down the celebrants for their sins than to suspect the contents of the barrels. This inability to identify the true cause of illness also allowed unscrupulous brewers and tavern keepers to operate with impunity. If a customer complained, the brewer could insist that the problem lay elsewhere, perhaps in something the drinker had eaten. In small villages, social pressure discouraged public accusations. To accuse the brewer was to risk alienating a neighbor or angering a powerful local family. Silence kept the peace, but it also kept dangerous brewing practices alive. Over time, this cultural blindness shaped the very way people thought about beer. It became both a comfort and an unquestioned necessity, its dangers hidden behind tradition and familiarity. No one imagined that their trusted drink could be carrying parasites from contaminated water, spores from moldy barrels, or toxic compounds from poorly chosen herbs. The fact that these threats were invisible made them all the more insidious. And yet, the danger wasn't just in what the beer carried, it was also in how it was handled after brewing. Even a well-made batch could turn deadly if stored in the wrong conditions, transported in tainted containers, or served from filthy mugs. In the medieval drinking culture, every stage between the brewery and the drinker's lips was an opportunity for unseen hazards to creep in. And those hazards didn't just affect individuals, they could spread silently through entire communities before anyone realized the scale of the problem. Street beer in the medieval world carried its own set of perils, layered on top of the dangers already found in tavern-brewed ale. Buying beer from a street vendor was often a matter of convenience, quick, cheap, and accessible to anyone passing through a busy marketplace. But those conveniences came at a hidden cost. Vendors sold their beer from open barrels, ceramic jugs, or wooden buckets balanced on carts, exposed to dust, flies, and the unpredictable elements. In bustling cities, the air itself carried particles from the refuse-filled streets, mingling with the scent of livestock, human waste, and rotting food. All of it had a way of settling into whatever liquid was left uncovered. Most of these street sellers were not brewers themselves. They bought surplus beer from local taverns, breweries, or even private households, often at a discounted rate because the beer was old, near spoilage, or already spoiled. To maximize profit, they sometimes mixed this older beer with small amounts of fresher brew, creating a deceptively smooth first taste that quickly gave way to the sourness of decay. Customers rarely saw the source of the beer. They only saw the mug being filled from a vendor's cask, and by then it was too late to question what was inside. The conditions in which this beer was transported made contamination almost inevitable. Vendors carried their stock through narrow, crowded streets where chamber pots were emptied from windows, horses clopped by leaving droppings in their wake, and butchers rinsed animal entrails into the gutters. If a cask leaked or splashed during transit, the vendor might simply top it off with water from the nearest public fountain or trough, unaware or uncaring that such water could be crawling with disease. In a time without sealed containers or sterilization, even a brief exposure could undo whatever safety the original brewing process might have provided. Temperature was another silent enemy. Beer sitting in the sun for hours would warm and sour quickly, and vendors had no ice or refrigeration to slow the process. On hot days, fermentation could restart inside the cask, creating a fizzy, unpredictable drink that could foam violently or taste sharply acidic. Some vendors tried to mask this by adding strong herbs, honey, or even soot from the bottom of a cooking pot to darken the beer and hide its cloudiness. Such tricks fooled the eye and sometimes the tongue, but they did nothing to remove the harmful bacteria or toxins already present. Street beer was also a communal experience, but not in the safe, sanitized sense we know today. Customers often drank from the same few wooden mugs provided by the vendor, rinsed in a shallow bucket of murky water between uses. That bucket might be changed once or twice a day, if at all, meaning that every sip was potentially shared with the last dozen strangers who had stood at the cart. For illnesses that spread through saliva, this was a perfect vehicle. Cold sores, throat infections, and other contagious ailments could pass invisibly from one drinker to the next, carried along with the cheap refreshment of a midday pint. The allure of street beer was strong, especially for laborers who couldn't afford to sit in a tavern and pay for multiple rounds. A quick mug from a vendor offered not only alcohol, but also much-needed calories from residual sugars and grain particles. For many, this was lunch, but hunger and thirst dulled the senses, and the urgency to quench both often outweighed caution. Even when the beer tasted off, most drank it anyway, reasoning that it was better than going without. This tolerance for questionable quality allowed street vendors to continue selling beer that a more discerning palate would have rejected outright. There were darker sides to this trade as well. In some cities, vendors who couldn't afford even spoiled beer from a brewer resorted to making their own crude batches in back rooms or alley sheds. These were hastily fermented in whatever container was available, a cracked barrel, a clay jar, even a repurposed animal hide. Without proper brewing knowledge or equipment, these concoctions could be wildly inconsistent, sometimes dangerously alcoholic, other times weak, but teeming with contaminants. Yet, in the crowded marketplace, they were sold alongside legitimate beer, indistinguishable to the average passerby until it was too late. The unpredictability of street beer mirrored the unpredictability of life itself in the Middle Ages. A single mug could bring warmth, camaraderie, and momentary relief from the day's grind, or it could bring fever, cramps, and days of weakness. And because buyers rarely knew the origins of what they drank, each sip was a gamble. In a world where survival often depended on taking risks, this gamble became a routine part of daily life. But if the streets could turn beer into such a hazard, imagine the false sense of security that came from believing alcohol alone could make any drink safe. That belief, perhaps more than anything else, ensured that dangerous beer would remain a silent companion at medieval tables. The belief that alcohol itself was a kind of built-in safeguard was one of the most persistent myths in the medieval world. People thought beer was immune to the dangers of bad water, moldy barrels, or poor hygiene because it contained alcohol. In their minds, alcohol was like an invisible guardian, killing anything harmful before it could do damage. This idea was comforting, especially in an age when safe drinking water was rare, but it was far from true. Alcohol can kill some microorganisms, but the relatively low levels found in most medieval beers were nowhere near strong enough to sterilize the drink. In fact, those beers often contain less alcohol than a modern light beer, making them far less capable of eliminating dangerous bacteria. Most medieval beer, especially the everyday kind consumed by workers, women, and even children, was small beer, a weak brew with just enough alcohol to add flavor and preserve it for a short period. This meant that if the water used was contaminated, or if the beer was exposed to filth after brewing, the alcohol did little to protect the drinker. A person could down several mugs in a day and still be swallowing the same pathogens they would have ingested by drinking untreated water. The belief in alcohol's protective power was an illusion, but it was an illusion people wanted to believe. This misunderstanding had deep cultural roots. Monasteries, which were some of the largest and most respected brewers in medieval Europe, also promoted beer as a wholesome drink. Monks brewed for their own consumption and for sale, and their word carried weight in matters of health and diet. If a trusted monk said beer was safe, people accepted it without question. In truth, monastic brewing was often cleaner than village brewing, but even here the same risks applied if the water source was tainted or the barrels poorly maintained. Faith in the moral authority of the brewer became a substitute for evidence. The belief in alcohol as a cleanser also encouraged risky behavior in storage and handling. Barrels might be left open in warm rooms or stored in damp cellars with mold creeping up the walls. Serving mugs might be rinsed only briefly, if at all, between customers. If questioned, tavern keepers could dismiss concerns with a wave of the hand and the reassurance that the beer keeps itself clean. This confidence was misplaced, but without any visible connection between beer and sickness, there was nothing to challenge it. In some cases, the false security of alcohol even led brewers to take shortcuts. Why waste fuel boiling the water thoroughly if the alcohol would take care of anything dangerous? Why replace a cracked barrel if the beer inside was supposedly immune to contamination? These decisions saved time and resources, but amplified the risks. The flaws in this thinking were invisible until someone fell ill, and even then, few made the connection. The blame fell elsewhere, on the weather, the food, or the supposed frailty of the sick person. The irony was that certain dangerous ingredients could actually thrive in alcoholic environments. Some molds and bacteria are tolerant to low alcohol levels, meaning they could survive and multiply even in beer. Mycotoxins from moldy grain, for example, are not destroyed by alcohol at all. These toxins could linger in the finished drink, causing headaches, stomach upset, or more severe long-term effects. Drinkers who trusted the beer to protect them might unknowingly be dosing themselves with poison. Even travelers and soldiers, who often relied on beer as a safe source of hydration, were not spared. Campaign accounts from medieval armies occasionally mention outbreaks of illness traced, though never officially blamed, to beer supplies that had been stored in hot wagons for days or weeks. The alcohol did little to halt the spoilage, and the sick troops paid the price. Yet the same practice continued because the myth was too deeply ingrained to challenge. This misplaced faith in alcohol's purity had a lasting cultural impact. It reinforced the idea that beer was not just a drink, but a kind of protective daily medicine. People who might otherwise have been cautious with water would drink beer freely, even in suspicious conditions. And while it is true that well-brewed beer could sometimes be safer than untreated water, the idea that it was always safe was one of the most dangerous misconceptions of the age. That confidence in safety made it all the more shocking when illness struck after a round of beer. But the shock never translated into reform, because no one wanted to accept that the drink they trusted every day could be part of the problem. And so, the cycle continued. People drank without question, believing themselves protected, even as unseen dangers waited in every mug. The next step in understanding these risks would come only when people began to see that the quality of beer could vary dramatically from one place to another, and that the safest drink wasn't always the one most readily at hand. A cloudy beer in the medieval period was more than just an aesthetic flaw. It was often a silent warning of what lay within. In an age without modern filtration or clarity standards, cloudiness was common, but its causes varied dramatically. Sometimes it came from harmless sediment, the remains of grain or yeast still suspended in the liquid. Other times, it was the visible result of spoilage, contamination, or even deliberate adulteration. The problem for the average drinker was simple. There was no reliable way to tell the difference just by looking, and in the dim light of a tavern or market stall, few even tried. For many medieval people, beer was expected to be opaque, especially the cheaper varieties known as small beer. These brews were made quickly, often in just a couple of days, and rarely allowed to settle before being served. They were drunk straight from the fermentation vessel or a freshly filled cask, still thick with yeast. In some cases, this cloudiness was even seen as a sign of freshness, but appearances could be deceiving. That same murky haze could just as easily be caused by bacterial bloom, mold spores, or mineral deposits from unclean water. When contamination was to blame, the cloudiness often carried other clues: an odd smell, a sour bite, or a faint metallic tang. Yet these warnings could be masked by strong herbs, heavy malt, or a liberal splash of honey. Brewers and tavern keepers had no shame in dressing up a questionable batch, especially when replacing it would mean a financial loss. In fact, the thick texture of cloudy beer sometimes worked in their favor, making it harder for drinkers to detect floating particles of mold, insect fragments, or dirt from poorly cleaned equipment. Serving vessels also played a role in hiding what was in the mug. Opaque ceramic jugs, heavy wooden tankards, or leather drinking flasks all concealed the true appearance of the beer inside. A customer might only catch a glimpse of the liquid while it was being poured, and by then, the transaction was complete. In this way, the visual cue of cloudiness, one of the few signals a drinker could rely on, was effectively removed from the equation. The causes of cloudy beer went beyond negligence. Sometimes, contamination happened after the beer left the brewer's hands. During transportation, casks could be jostled over rough roads, stirring up sediment from the bottom. Barrels stored in damp cellars might develop mold on the inside walls, releasing spores into the liquid. In open-air markets, dust and debris could drift into an uncovered serving vessel, turning a once-clear drink into something murky and suspicious. And since there was no refrigeration, any beer left sitting for too long could begin to ferment again, creating haze and off-flavors in just a matter of hours. Cultural perception added another layer of complexity. In some regions, beer was expected to be thick and hearty, almost like a liquid bread. Farmers and laborers valued these dense brews for their filling quality, often drinking them in place of a meal. In such contexts, cloudiness wasn't a warning sign, it was a promise of sustenance. This made it even easier for dangerous beer to slip unnoticed into daily life, especially among those who relied on it as a primary food source. The real danger of cloudy beer wasn't just what it contained, but what it concealed. Murkiness could hide the early signs of spoilage, such as floating mold colonies or tiny worms from infested grain. It could mask discoloration from rusted brewing tools or leaching from poorly made metal fittings. In some extreme cases, brewers even added substances like chalk or flour to create artificial cloudiness, either to disguise low-quality ingredients or to mimic the appearance of richer, more nourishing beer. These additives did nothing to improve safety. In fact, they sometimes introduced new contaminants. There were moments when the danger revealed itself too late. A group of drinkers might share a cask at a festival, only to discover hours later that they all suffered from the same violent stomach illness. Without the ability to trace the source of the problem, they might blame bad food, a change in weather, or even supernatural causes. The cloudiness of the beer they had enjoyed earlier would fade from memory, dismissed as unremarkable in a world where clarity was a rarity. In truth, the cloudiness of medieval beer was a mirror of the broader risks of the time. What you saw was rarely the whole story. The appearance of a drink could be reassuring or alarming, but it was never conclusive. People drank because they had to, because beer was part of the fabric of daily life, and because the dangers were hidden in plain sight. And if a cloudy beer could hide so much from the eye, then the next question was even more unsettling. What happened when the danger couldn't be seen, smelled, or tasted at all? One of the most troubling aspects of beer in the medieval world was how illness could strike without any clear cause, and how few people ever suspected their drink. Without the scientific framework to link cause and effect, sickness seemed to be the product of chance, divine will, or the shifting of the seasons. A farmer might work the fields for days without issue, then wake one morning doubled over with stomach pain, and neither he nor his neighbors would think to trace it back to the beer they had all been sharing the night before. The symptoms caused by contaminated beer could mimic almost every other common ailment of the era. Nausea, cramps, diarrhea, fever, dizziness. These were so frequent in daily life that they were almost considered normal. In a society where the average person dealt regularly with spoiled food, unsafe water, and unhygienic living conditions, there was no reason to suspect one particular drink. This made beer's role as a silent vector all the more insidious. People would fall ill, recover, and then return to the same tavern or street vendor, never realizing they were walking back into the source of their misery. Compounding the problem was the communal nature of drinking. Beer was often consumed in groups, poured from the same pitcher or ladled from the same open cask. Mugs passed from hand to hand, lips touched the same rim. And in many cases, there was only a token rinse and a bucket of stale water between uses. This alone was enough to spread bacteria or viruses, but when the beer itself was already contaminated, it became a double assault on the drinker's health. Outbreaks of illness could sweep through entire neighborhoods without anyone realizing they were tied to a single shared drink. The delay between consumption and symptoms also clouded the connection. Some of the most dangerous contaminants, like certain molds or bacteria, took hours or even days to cause visible illness. By the time the stomach cramps or fever began, the drinker might have eaten multiple meals and had several other drinks, making it impossible to pinpoint the true culprit. The illness was then attributed to bad air from the marshes, a curse or an imbalance of the humors, the prevailing medical theory of the time. This ignorance kept contaminated beer flowing freely, because no one saw a reason to stop it. There were also cases where illness became so routine that it simply faded into the background. In many rural communities, people lived with a near constant state of low-level sickness, fatigue, digestive trouble, headaches. When everyone felt unwell to some degree, the idea that a specific food or drink was responsible seemed absurd. This normalized suffering allowed dangerous brewing practices to persist for generations. A slightly sour taste, a hint of haze, or a faintly musty smell were brushed off as quirks of the batch rather than red flags. The lack of regulation only made matters worse. Brewers faced little to no oversight, especially in smaller towns and villages. Even if customers suspected the beer was making them sick, what could they do? Complaints might be met with hostility, ridicule, or even accusations of slander. In some cases, the brewer was a respected member of the community or connected to the local authorities, making it socially or politically dangerous to question their product. People learned quickly to keep their concerns to themselves, and so the cycle continued. What's more, medieval beer was not always made fresh. In times of shortage or poor harvests, brewers might store beer for longer than was safe, especially if they had no other product to sell. As beer aged in poorly maintained barrels, the risk of contamination grew, but the choice between selling questionable beer or earning no income at all was an easy one for those struggling to survive. And for the customers, the choice between drinking that beer or going without any drinkable liquid was equally clear. In rare but telling instances, whole gatherings were struck down after drinking from the same contaminated batch. Chronicles record wedding feasts where guests fell ill en masse, or military encampments where soldiers were incapacitated after receiving tainted beer rations. These events should have been clear warnings, but the lessons never stuck. Instead, they became cautionary tales stripped of their real cause, told as moral stories about gluttony or the dangers of overindulgence. The true danger lay not just in the beer itself, but in the blind trust placed in it. People drank without questioning its safety because it was familiar, because it was part of their culture, and because it was supposed to be safer than water. But in a world where brewing often took place in filthy conditions, with contaminated ingredients and no understanding of germs, the trust was misplaced. And if beer could silently make entire communities sick without their knowledge, then the very fabric of medieval daily life was woven with an invisible thread of danger, one that stretched far beyond the brewing barrel and into every aspect of how people lived and survived. Superstition, and the absence of scientific understanding, shaped every corner of medieval life, and beer was no exception. In a world without microscopes, without knowledge of bacteria or toxins, the human mind filled in the blanks with explanations drawn from religion, folklore, and fear. When people fell ill after drinking beer, they did not imagine invisible pathogens. They imagined curses, bad omens, or divine punishment. In many cases, the more mysterious the sickness, the more supernatural the explanation became. The dominant framework for understanding health at the time was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these fluids, often brought on by weather changes, emotional states, or moral failings. If a mug of beer happened to tip someone into illness, it was not the beer that was blamed, but the individual's weak constitution or a sudden shift in the season. The idea that something in the drink itself could be the source of harm was simply outside the scope of accepted medical thought. Religion played an equally powerful role in shaping perception. Beer, especially when brewed in monasteries, was often considered a blessing, a wholesome product of the monks' labor and devotion. If sickness followed its consumption, it was easier to believe that God was delivering a lesson or punishment than to suspect the purity of a drink made under holy supervision. Pilgrims would travel miles to drink the beer of certain abbeys, trusting it to restore strength or health. The possibility that it might carry the same risks as any other medieval brew rarely entered their minds. This reliance on spiritual explanations also provided cover for unscrupulous brewers. A tavern keeper whose beer made customers sick could shrug and suggest that the victim had been struck by the evil eye or crossed paths with a jealous neighbor's curse. In rural communities, where gossip and superstition spread faster than facts, such explanations could be accepted without question. The real cause, moldy barrels, spoiled water, or toxic herbs, remained unaddressed, allowing the same hazards to appear again and again. Superstition could even influence brewing methods directly. Some brewers incorporated charms or rituals into their process, believing they could ensure a successful, safe batch. They might stir the mash a certain number of times in a specific direction, or hang protective amulets above the brewing vat. While harmless in themselves, these practices replaced genuine cleanliness and quality control with symbolic gestures, leaving the beer vulnerable to the very dangers the charms were meant to ward off. There were also dark beliefs about intentional harm. In times of tension between villages, rival taverns, or even family members, accusations of bewitching the beer could lead to serious consequences. A spoiled batch might be blamed on a suspected witch, and entire communities could be whipped into panic. The accused, often women on the margins of society, could be punished or even executed based on nothing more than the fact that someone's beer had turned sour or made people ill. In this way, superstition not only blinded people to the real causes of contamination, but also turned brewing mishaps into weapons of social persecution. Interestingly, some of these superstitions contained faint traces of truth, buried under layers of myth. For example, the belief that certain days were unlucky for brewing may have been based on seasonal realities. Hot, humid weather was indeed more likely to spoil a batch. But without the scientific knowledge to explain why, the warning became entangled with astrology, omens, and old wives' tales. People followed the rule without understanding it, and in doing so, sometimes avoided danger by accident rather than design. This blending of faith, fear, and ignorance created a perfect environment for dangerous beer to persist. As long as illness could be explained away as fate, magic, or divine will, there was no incentive to change brewing methods, improve hygiene, or examine ingredients more closely. The invisible killers hiding in the brew, bacteria, toxins, parasites, were beyond imagination, and so they went unchallenged. Yet, as the centuries wore on, moments of doubt began to creep in. Observant drinkers might notice that beer from certain brewers made people sick more often than others, or that illness was more common after drinking from particular barrels. These observations hinted at patterns, and patterns invited questions. But until those questions could be answered with evidence rather than superstition, the medieval drinker remained at the mercy of both the beer and the beliefs that shielded its dangers from view. And when those beliefs were finally challenged, the shift would open the door to a new understanding, one in which beer's role in spreading disease could no longer be hidden behind charms and prayers. Epidemics in the medieval world rarely had a single, obvious source, and that made beer a perfect, silent accomplice. When a wave of illness swept through a town or village, the blame often fell on the usual suspects: bad air, rotting food, contact with the sick, or even divine punishment. The role of beer, so deeply woven into daily life, was almost never questioned. People drank it in the morning with bread, at midday with stew, and in the evening to wash away the fatigue of the day. It was not just a drink, it was a staple of survival. That made it all the more dangerous when contamination in the brewing process helped fuel a wider outbreak. The brewing environment was an ideal incubator for disease-causing agents. Large quantities of water sat in open vats, attracting insects and rodents. Grains stored for brewing could be damp or moldy, hosting fungi that produced toxins capable of weakening the immune system. When such beer was consumed en masse, at a market day, a festival, or a religious feast, the effects could ripple through the community with terrifying speed. People began falling ill at the same time, their symptoms similar enough to suggest a common source. Yet the idea that the beloved beer could be that source was unthinkable. Historical records give tantalizing glimpses into these patterns. In certain outbreaks, described by chroniclers, illness appeared most heavily in those who had attended specific gatherings. A harvest celebration, for example, might leave dozens bedridden, while neighboring villages remained healthy. Sometimes, the victims were not just peasants, but wealthy merchants, clergy, or even minor nobility, people who had shared in the same ceremonial casks of ale. The absence of social boundaries in beer drinking meant that epidemics could cut across class lines, making them all the more visible, yet no easier to trace. The most insidious cases were those in which beer did not directly cause the disease, but made people more vulnerable to it. Poor quality beer brewed with contaminated water or infested grain could lead to malnutrition, dehydration, or chronic digestive issues. A weakened body was far less able to resist more virulent infections like dysentery, typhoid, or even the plague. In this way, beer could act as a quiet accomplice, softening a community's defenses just before a larger epidemic struck. In times of crisis, such as during the Black Death, beer retained its central role. Some people even drank more of it, believing the alcohol would protect them from illness or that it would purify the body. This false confidence meant that even during widespread disease, the same unhygienic brewing and serving practices continued without pause. Communal mugs still passed from hand to hand, barrels still stood open in the streets, and no one imagined that these rituals could be helping to spread death itself. There are recorded instances where authorities attempted to regulate beer during outbreaks, though not for the reasons we might expect today. In some towns, officials banned the sale of beer by unlicensed vendors during periods of sickness, fearing that adulterated or poorly made beer would cause unrest among the population. But these measures were aimed more at maintaining public order and preventing drunken disorder than at stopping disease. Without the knowledge of germ theory, there was no real way to connect the dots between beer and epidemic patterns. The mobility of beer also played a role in spreading illness. Merchants transported barrels from one town to another, often without cleaning them properly between uses. A cask that had once held contaminated beer could infect the next batch poured into it, carrying the problem across miles. In markets and fairs, where travelers from distant regions mingled, beer was one of the few shared consumables, and thus one of the most effective ways for pathogens to hitch a ride from one community to the next. Even the celebrations that beer was most associated with, weddings, feast days, seasonal fairs, were high-risk events in times of disease. Hundreds might gather in close quarters, sharing drink and food, laughing and singing, unaware that every toast was a chance for illness to move invisibly among them. When sickness appeared days later, the joy of the event gave way to whispered speculation about curses or divine anger, while the beer barrels from the feast sat empty, their role forgotten. In this way, beer's place in medieval society made it a silent enabler of some of the most devastating outbreaks of the era. It was trusted, it was beloved, and it was everywhere, which is precisely why it could do so much harm without anyone realizing it. And if beer could spread sickness so widely in times of celebration, the danger became even more complex when it was sold casually on the streets by those who had little control over its quality or cleanliness. That is where the risks took on an entirely new and unpredictable shape. Street beer might have been the cheapest and most accessible drink in a medieval city, but it was also one of the most unpredictable, and often the most dangerous. Unlike beer served in established taverns or monasteries, street beer was sold in an environment where quality control was virtually non-existent. Vendors operated out of carts, makeshift stalls, or even from barrels carried on their backs, roaming crowded market squares and narrow alleyways. The beer they sold could come from any number of sources, and that was the first layer of risk. Many street vendors did not brew their own beer. Instead, they purchased surplus or unwanted stock from taverns, breweries, and even private households. Often these were barrels past their prime, already turning sour, or leftover dregs that would otherwise be discarded. To make it stretch further, vendors might dilute the beer with water that was frequently drawn from public fountains or nearby streams, both of which were exposed to animal waste, household refuse, and the filth of the streets. The dilution not only weakened the beer, but also reintroduced all the pathogens that the brewing process might have killed. Transporting beer to market added another layer of hazard. Casks were loaded onto carts without protection from the sun or rain, and each jolt from the cobbled roads stirred up whatever sediment or contaminants were already inside. Wooden barrels were rarely airtight, allowing air and insects to slip in during the journey. Flies, attracted to the sweet, yeasty smell, would land on the beer, carrying with them bacteria from dung heaps and refuse piles. Rats, ever present in medieval cities, were drawn to the scent as well, sometimes gnawing through casks to get to the liquid inside. Once in the marketplace, the beer was typically served from open containers, scooped into mugs or ladles without any form of sanitation. These mugs were communal. Customers drank, returned them, and watched as they were rinsed in the same shallow basin of murky water before being handed to the next person. That water, after hours of use, became a soup of saliva, food particles, and whatever illnesses the morning's customers carried. Yet no one questioned the practice. It was simply the way things were done. The street itself was a constant source of contamination. Market stalls were crowded together, with butchers slaughtering animals just steps away from fishmongers gutting their catch. Blood, fish scales, and offal drained into the same gutters where children played and dogs scavenged. The smells of roasting meat, human sweat, and raw sewage mixed in the air, settling as a fine layer of grime on everything, including the beer casks. Vendors, often working from dawn until dusk, had little time or resources to protect their product from this environment. Some vendors attempted to mask the signs of spoilage with additives. Strong herbs, honey, or spices were stirred into the beer to disguise sourness or strange odors. In some cases, soot from the bottom of cooking pots was used to darken the beer, giving it the appearance of a richer, more expensive brew. While these tricks might fool the eye and even the palate for a moment, they did nothing to remove the underlying contamination. In fact, the added ingredients could themselves carry dirt or bacteria. The unpredictability of street beer was part of its danger. One day, a customer might get a relatively fresh brew purchased directly from a brewer that morning. The next, they might drink something that had been sitting in a barrel for weeks, steadily turning more toxic. This uncertainty didn't stop people from buying it, though. For laborers, travelers, and the poor, street beer was one of the few affordable options for refreshment and calories during a long day. It was quicker and cheaper than sitting in a tavern, and it didn't require the formality or the cost of table service. But that convenience came with a hidden cost. Because street beer was consumed quickly and casually, people rarely took note of its taste or quality. A foul aftertaste could be dismissed as just a different batch, and any illness that followed hours later would be attributed to something else entirely. The lack of accountability was total. Vendors could sell bad beer in one part of town, then move to another market the next day with no consequences. Even more dangerously, street beer could become a vehicle for spreading sickness between neighborhoods. A vendor buying beer from a contaminated source in one quarter of the city could unknowingly carry it across town, introducing illness to people who otherwise might not have been exposed. In this way, the humble beer cart could become as much a part of an epidemic's path as any rat or flea. The mingling of speed, accessibility, and complete disregard for hygiene made street beer a gamble every time it was poured. It was a drink that could refresh and nourish, or quietly sow the seeds of disease. And for those who believed that buying directly from a brewer or trusted tavern offered a safeguard, there was yet another uncomfortable truth. Even the most carefully made beer could be compromised before it ever reached the drinker's lips. That danger lay hidden in the very culture of how beer was shared and consumed, regardless of where it was brewed. The belief that alcohol could purify whatever it touched was one of the most persistent and most dangerous misconceptions of the medieval drinking world. It offered people a false sense of security, a comforting assurance that even if the water used to brew was questionable, the finished beer would be safe simply because it contained alcohol. In reality, the everyday beers consumed by most of the population were far too weak to kill the majority of dangerous microbes. This was especially true of small beer, the low-alcohol brew given to laborers, the elderly, and even children, which often contain no more than 1 to 2% alcohol by volume. To put that into perspective, modern disinfectants require far higher alcohol concentrations, often above 60%, to reliably kill harmful bacteria and viruses. Medieval beer, with its modest alcohol content, was incapable of neutralizing many of the pathogens that thrived in the contaminated water, grain, and storage vessels of the time. Yet people clung to the idea that beer was inherently clean, because to question it would be to question one of the few reliable sources of hydration in their lives. Monasteries, which were among the most respected brewers of the era, unintentionally reinforced this myth. Monastic beer was often brewed with better care than that made in small village operations. And because monks were associated with learning, piety, and discipline, their products carried an aura of safety. If a monk's beer made someone sick, the cause was assumed to be divine will, a personal weakness, or the influence of outside forces, never the drink itself. This reputation for wholesomeness extended to secular brewers who could claim any link, however tenuous, to monastic methods, further cementing the belief that brewing and sanctity went hand in hand. The misconception also had practical consequences for how beer was stored and served. Brewers and tavern keepers often saw no need to take extra precautions once fermentation was complete. A cracked barrel? The alcohol will protect it. A mug rinsed in dirty water? The alcohol will kill anything harmful. Beer stored in a damp, moldy cellar? The alcohol will make it safe to drink. Each of these assumptions ignored the fact that low alcohol environments can still host bacteria, mold, and parasites quite comfortably. Some of these organisms are even adapted to survive in mildly alcoholic conditions, making them especially dangerous because they could persist undetected in the drink. In some cases, the false sense of security led brewers to take shortcuts in the brewing process itself. Why waste precious firewood bringing water to a full boil if the alcohol would purify it anyway? Why discard a batch that smelled a bit off when its flavor could be masked with strong herbs or spices? Why scrub brewing tools thoroughly when a quick rinse would do? These decisions, made for the sake of efficiency or profit, created perfect conditions for contamination to flourish. There were also certain dangers that alcohol could do nothing to address. Mycotoxins from moldy grain, for example, are not destroyed by fermentation. These toxins could survive in the finished beer, causing illness over time and weakening the body's resistance to other infections. Similarly, metals leaching from poorly made brewing equipment or from storage containers could accumulate in the drink, posing a slow but serious threat to health. None of these hazards were mitigated by alcohol, yet they were routinely ignored under the comforting banner of the self-cleaning beer. The consequences could be especially severe in environments where beer was consumed in large quantities. Soldiers on campaign, for instance, might drink from communal casks that had been left in the sun for days, the liquid inside fermenting unpredictably and teeming with bacteria. The alcohol content, minimal to begin with, would offer no protection. In the cramped, unsanitary conditions of a military camp, a spoiled beer supply could quickly sicken dozens, reducing fighting strength and morale. Similar problems occurred on ships, where beer was stored for long voyages and could turn sour or contaminated long before the journey ended. This unwavering faith in alcohol's supposed purifying power did more than just allow contaminated beer to circulate. It actively encouraged people to drink it in situations where it was most dangerous. In towns suffering from outbreaks of disease, beer consumption often increased, fueled by the belief that it was safer than water. But if the beer had been brewed or stored in contaminated conditions, every sip only helped spread the very illnesses people were trying to avoid. It was a dangerous irony. The drink believed to be a shield could, in the wrong circumstances, become a silent weapon. And because the idea of alcohol as a universal cleanser was so deeply embedded in medieval culture, it persisted unchallenged for centuries. This misplaced confidence created an environment where even the most obvious signs of spoilage, a sour tang, an unpleasant odor, a haze in the mug, could be dismissed with a shrug and the reassurance that the beer will keep you safe. But safety in the medieval drinking world was never that simple. Even when beer started its life as fresh, clean, and carefully brewed, there were countless ways for it to be compromised before reaching the drinker's lips. The journey from the brewery to the mug was fraught with hazards, and every stage along the way was an opportunity for contamination to creep in unnoticed. And the final stage, how that beer was served and shared, often erased whatever protection might have existed at the start. By the later Middle Ages, beer was no longer a local curiosity. It was a daily necessity, and its presence on the table was as predictable as bread. But with that ubiquity came an enormous range in quality, safety, and taste. The experience of drinking beer could vary dramatically depending on where you were, who brewed it, and how it had been handled along the way. For some, a mug of beer from a reputable brewer was nourishing, hearty, and relatively safe. For others, especially those in poorer districts or rural villages, each sip was a gamble, the drink's appearance and smell offering little warning about the dangers it might carry. One of the great divides in beer safety came down to resources. Wealthier towns with established brewing guilds often enforced basic standards, not out of modern concern for health, but to protect their economic reputation. Brewers in these guilds competed for the favor of prominent customers, and they could not afford the scandal of consistently foul beer. They invested in better grain, kept their barrels in drier storage, and sometimes even secured cleaner water from private wells or upstream sources. The result was beer that, while far from sterile by modern standards, was less likely to cause immediate illness. In smaller villages, the story was different. Brewing might be done seasonally, in cramped kitchens or smoky sheds, with equipment shared among neighbors and stored in whatever corner was available. Grains could be of lower quality, scavenged from stores already beginning to spoil, and water often came from the nearest accessible source, regardless of its purity. A single bad harvest could mean brewing with whatever was left, sometimes moldy, sometimes infested, because beer was too central to daily life to stop making it altogether. Even in towns with guild regulations, the journey from brewer to drinker introduced countless risks. Beer was rarely consumed directly where it was brewed. It passed through a network of taverns, merchants, and street vendors before reaching its final destination. Each transfer meant pouring it into a new container. Each container carried its own history of neglect or contamination, and each stage added time for the beer to spoil. A well-brewed beer leaving the brewery could be unrecognizable by the time it reached a customer's mug across town. This was especially true during festivals, fairs, and public gatherings. Brewers eager to meet the surge in demand might cut corners to produce larger quantities quickly, leaving fermentation incomplete or failing to boil the water properly. Once the beer arrived at the event, it often sat in open barrels for hours or days, exposed to dust, insects, and curious hands. In the chaos of a celebration, there was little chance of catching a bad batch before it was served. Guests who fell ill later might have no idea that the cheerful toast of the night had been the start of their misery. Even the social rituals around beer made it harder to avoid bad brews. To refuse a drink could be seen as rude or ungrateful, especially when offered by a host or shared among friends. People were expected to join in, and any hesitation could invite suspicion or offense. This social pressure meant that even when someone suspected a drink might be off, because of a strange smell, a cloudy pour, or a sharp sourness, they often drank it anyway. In some communities, such reluctance was even interpreted as a sign of mistrust, which could carry consequences far beyond a single evening's discomfort. Travelers faced a different kind of uncertainty. Moving from one region to another meant encountering entirely new brewing traditions, local ingredients, and water sources. A merchant might enjoy robust, flavorful beer in one town, only to be served a thin, bitter, or even rancid brew in the next. Without the ability to preserve beer for long journeys, freshness was never guaranteed, and buying from an unfamiliar brewer was always a leap of faith. In this way, beer could serve as both a welcome comfort and a potential trap for those on the road. What made all these risks so enduring was the lack of a clear connection between beer and illness in the public mind. Because sickness could take hours or days to appear, and because so many other hazards existed in medieval life, beer rarely took the blame. This allowed brewing practices to remain largely unchanged for centuries, even as people grew more aware of other dangers like spoiled meat or foul-smelling water. Beer retained its place of trust on the table, not because it had earned it, but because no one was prepared to imagine life without it. And so, in a world where beer varied wildly from one sip to the next, the safest choice was often a matter of luck rather than planning. A careful brewer might keep illness at bay for a time, but the chain of handling, storage, and serving was too long to control completely. The mug you lifted could contain a drink that would nourish you after a long day, or one that would lay you low without warning. It was a daily gamble, accepted by everyone from the humblest laborer to the most powerful lord. And if beer could not always be trusted, It left one unsettling question lingering over the medieval table. What else, in their world, so familiar and essential, might be carrying hidden dangers that no one yet had the means to see?